Vishakha, we know the kind of projects that POV has spearheaded outside of like law enforcement kind of procedure. You have initiatives like the Tech Saki, and we'd just like to understand what your experience has been so far and what were some of the common concerns that came up and how you wanted to address this.
Thanks so much, Kaustuba. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Super. And thank you for thinking of point of view, all your kind words and having me on the panel. Very briefly, Tech Saki is a Hindi helpline that we started 1.5 years ago, which basically deals with digital security and what we call online gender based violence or technology facilitated gender based violence, right? And it's in Hindi. It's now actually we are trialing it in Bengali and Marathi, and it's a voice helpline, so people can call in with their queries, etc., and we have people to respond to them. So I think some of the things that we are seeing, because we receive a large number of calls each month, almost 1,000 or so, and not all of them are relevant calls, but a lot of them are. I think what we're seeing is basically that online gender based violence and threats and harms are expanding rapidly, right? So, one of the biggest set of calls actually now pertains to financial fraud. So, we have people, right, like all sorts of things. People who've basically had, have lost money from using, say, Paytm or, some of the other payment processing apps, etc., etc. I mean, there's a very wide range. And I think the interesting thing here is that even though we think about it as a digital security issue, and it is, of course, that, I wonder whether a small part of it is also an online gender based violence issue, simply because what we're also seeing is that, there are a lot of calls around digital literacy and security, right? And it's very clear that women and don't have the opportunities to really play with mobile technologies or digital technologies, and therefore have less, like, are less digitally literate in a sense, right? And therefore what we also find is whether it's loan apps, job apps, all these things are actually targeting women, because if you're running a fraud kind of or a scam, you will target the person who is most vulnerable in this situation, right? So I'm also wondering whether we need to think about some of these as sort of either on the borders of online gender-based violence, etc., because it's very clear that women are being targeted. The second thing that I think we see, which is a complicated thing, is we get quite a small number, but of cases that are around sextortion, right? Where you basically, somebody is being blackmailed with the threat of having their intimate or nude images exposed, or often it's not even their images. It's much more that they've got into a chat with somebody on WhatsApp, and that person has then, revealed themselves in some way and taken a screenshot or a video, and said, okay, now I'm going to expose this and you need to pay me some money. The interesting thing here is in most of these cases, the uh, complainant is actually male. And when we think of gender based violence, we think of it as happening predominantly to women or people of different marginalized genders or gender minorities. So we don't really know how to think about cases like sextortion, right? Is it part of online gender based violence? Where should we sort of place it? And I think the third experience I'd like to share is that there are such few remedies. So all the responders, are basically trying to tell people who call either how they can work with their privacy settings, etc., on particular platforms, or turn to the platforms for reporting. So they literally walk them through it step by step, or go to the cybercrime portal, right? So turn to the law in a sense. But frankly, most callers don't want to go to the law except as the last resort, because we know that it's a complicated process, right, which can often feel very punishing. So what's coming through is that there are very few responses to these issues.
Thank you, Vishakha. I think you're absolutely right about how law enforcement usually becomes the last resort, and people are very hesitant and afraid of approaching it. In that sense, you do have different programs that are more educating the population, like digital gender justice or the digital everyday. And I just wanted to understand what the reception has been to these programs. What kind of impact did you see happening? And did you see that people were moving past this sort of reluctance or fear that they face about not just being subject to these circumstances, but finding redressal?
Thanks, Kostuba. Okay, so I think what we are trying to do is we recognize that if we want to change individual lives and we want to change the lives of women, trans, queer persons in digital spaces, right, and make this space much more gender just, we've realized that we can't work only at the individual level. As much as we try to empower them, we might have to work with shifting the ecosystem, because no individual lives in a vacuum, right? Like we're all surrounded by communities, ecosystems, etc. So, for instance, with digital gender justice, what we try and do is we worked with a lot of again, young women, adolescents, queer and trans people in low income communities. And we are trying to bring this concept saying that when we think about gender equality or gender justice, we often think about it only in physical spaces. Right. But the thing is, in today's world where we live phygital lives or hybrid lives with, one hand on the mobile, one foot on the ground, we will have to think about gender justice in both spaces, and both these spaces influence each other, right? So what we try and do is, for instance, we talk about gender norms, and I'll give you one example. Like, we see in public spaces offline, like on the streets, that women's bodies are often treated like public property. Anybody feels you can comment on what a woman is wearing, how they look, their body shape, size, whatever, right? So it's like, oh, your body is public property. But we see the same thing in digital spaces, only it's with our images, where again the images are commented on, treated however. So, what we're trying to say is that actually in patriarchal societies, the same rules and norms that govern our lives in physical spaces are coming online. So, if we look at it like this, at the top of it, we're seeing the tech, but below that, there are these invisible gender norms or gender rules. And if we want to bring gender equality in digital spaces, we have to work sort of through the iceberg in a sense, right? With tech on top, but also with these sort of patriarchal rules below. So that's kind of the concept of digital gender justice. I think it's really helped people understand that they have some rights in digital spaces. Because otherwise, if you think of just, people who like buy a phone one day and then suddenly all sorts of things start happening, people are like, hey, I have no idea if there are any laws, if they're like, what am I supposed to do? So people really feel powerless. So they need some concepts and a whole bunch of other things that can help them. So I think that's about that. And then the digital everyday is actually an interesting online course where we are really trying to get activists, researchers, journalists, technologists, artists, designers, etc., academics to think much more deeply about the relationship between technologies, bodies, and social justice. And so it's semi academic, it's conceptual, but we also feel that, if we really want to have sort of build an alternate digital society, something that's much more about social justice, that we as activists first need to understand all this very deeply. So that's again had a very solid impact among a smaller group of people.
Thank you. Absolutely. I think your iceberg um, way of explaining what happens was very beautifully put because, yes, we do have a different platform with tech, but the gender norms are still at the very root of how things take place. With that in mind, my next question was what are these recourses that we can take outside of law, outside, like you have done digital gender justice, digital everyday. Is there something that we are not looking into yet that we should absolutely be doing to um, be more effective in how we not only help people facing these circumstances, but also build a better ecosystem, like you said?
Okay, so if we focus on online gender based violence, right? And I was really thinking after you sent us the questions, I think if we look at sort of physical gender based violence, we find that there are many more remedies, right? Like there's counseling, there's much more of a survivor centered approach. Of course, there are laws, there's also civil um, legislation. Like in India, we have something called the PWDVA, Protection of Women from Domestic Violence Act, which came in, I think, almost 20 years ago. But it shifted it gave women a way to approach this through civil remedies rather than only through criminal laws, right? So, again, I think we need to put the person at the center who's facing online gender based violence and say what are her needs or what are their needs. So, again, empathy, counseling, there's very little of that available, right? Of course, we have to push the tech platforms for accountability, to make their content moderation actually and their community guidelines actually work for people, right? To be way more transparent, etc. I think it would be wonderful if we could think about things like monetary fines or penalties, right? For certain kinds of, like if we think of traffic offenses, what's the main way of dealing with traffic offenses is we have to pay fines, etc., right? We don't go to jail sometimes, but it has a deterrent effect. And I think given the like we have millions of sort of episodes or incidents in digital spaces, and criminal laws are not going to be able to deal with all of them, and neither does it meet survivors' needs. But what if we had systems like penalties, where, and those could go into a sort of fund, right? A public fund to actually, I think, frankly, if you hit people where it hurts, like economically, you'd see a lot of low level things, right? Even if someone sets up a fake profile or a second one, but again, if you find that account and you're like, hey, if you don't pay this fine within 7 days, we're going to shut down the account. There's only going to be so many times that person is going to do it. So I think we have to think a little more creatively and, of course, keep empowering individuals and communities through information, through building capacities, all of that.